Together.
Playing.
It is.
Yes, not the how-to. Welcome to Wizard World Austin Comic Con 2018. How to be a supervillain? No! Supervillian Psychology. Who wants to be the bad guy?
Me, Marcy. What?
Well, I was using it as a subtitle. Not a question. So we'll get to discussing that one and why. Actually, I kind of want their answers on that one now. We'll a little bit ask that one. All right. I am Dr. Travis Langley, professor of psychology at Superherologist on Twitter. The third most followed psychology professor on Twitter. Yeah, and something like number 9 in all psychologists, something like that. And so when I found out the third, someone had gone through the figures, it's like, I actually thought it was number 2. I didn't know about one of those other people. I am best known as the author of the book Batman in Psychology, A Dark and Stormy Night, the best book on Batman ever written by me. The editor and lead writer of a series of other books, about half of which look at comic book characters. Captain America vs. Iron Man, Freedom, Security, Psychology, with foreword by that Stan Lee guy. Wonder Woman Psychology, Last Wing to Truth, where we have to look at a mentally healthy person. Daredevil Psychology, The Devil You Know, not about looking at a mentally healthy person. Also with foreword by that Stan Lee guy. Panelists, who are you? What are you known for?
My name is Barrett Drive. I have a podcast called The Dark Knight Reads, where me and my partner Devin Coleman are reading every Detective Comics and Batman comic ever written in hopes to figure out the definitive version of The Dark Knight. It's probably not going to happen, but we're going to do our best. You can also find me locally. I perform as an improviser most of the times at Cold Town Theater. So that's me.
I'm Scylla Hagel. I have a YouTube show, JOFTV. You can find it at youtube.com/JOFTV. Host with my wife, Shannon, and we talk about pretty much anything you're seeing here, any fandom, just anything within the geek culture.
My name is Scott Murray. I host and produce a couple of geek podcasts. One is called The Geek Supreme, where our opinions either gain us or lose us points, depending on how good or bad it is, depending on what Dark Taxes thinks. Comic Book Noob, which helps people who are only familiar with characters on screen and they get to know them on the comic book side of things. And I just released a new fiction podcast, superhero-themed action comedy fiction podcast called The Crimson Files.
And my name is Joshua Robertson. I am a licensed master social worker with minors in psychology and sociology. Most of my training is in neuroscience and the long-term development of trauma and its effects on children. And I am most known for my Thrice 9 Legends saga. I'm an author in dark fantasy. The 3 books in front of me are actually all books that are written from the villain's perspective.
We'll ask him how he gets to know what a villain's perspective is. In the
I've
meantime,
worked with several thousand clients.
so I guess you should, if you would share that one, it's probably easier than 3 of us sharing this one. So, what is a supervillain? Any of you? Well, we're starting with them. Then you get your turn. We don't need video. We're good.
I'm gonna put your graphic up.
Oh yes, make sure they know which panel this is if they walk in. Ignore the man you're.
Yeah.
What is a supervillain? Now we still have a few seconds to let y'all think.
Hollywood magic.
I'm probably going to take a cop-out answer with it, but a villain for me, of course, is somebody who's going to be going against the norms of society, that's going to be acting in a way that is not societally acceptable. Oftentimes, I guess, embracing some vice and using it, but the big thing that I think that really identifies villains is that they usually have some sort of vice that they just can't get over. They always go back to it. There's no redeemable qualities to help them overcome that. In terms of super, I feel like they have to have some sort of superhero to contend against. So in order to be a supervillain, you have to be a counterpart to fight against a superhero.
Yep, I like that take a lot. And sometimes
don't just agree with each other.
I'm about to disagree.
Okay.
So I talked about superheroes and supervillains my whole life, various people, and one question that came up with some of my friends, one of my best friends, the history professor, is have there ever been any actual supervillains in real life, like people you could call out and say like, yes, this person actually made the transition from just like.
I'd call Hitler a villain.
Would you? Wow, wait and take a stand. That would be one I think that would actually cross the line into super villainy without having to have a superhero to fight against. I also think like Zodiac Killer, because of the theatricality of the crimes that he was involved in. Maybe Jack the Ripper for taunting the police, and you could make the argument that Aberline was his superhero, but I don't know. And I think there's a few other people in history that you could point at and say like they were villains and supervillains in the real world without having had a superhero, because we don't really have any superheroes in the world.
You could also take people who
Apparently we have more panelists up here. They can't hear you very well back there, so if you could just wait till we have questions so that I can repeat things that they'd have more trouble hearing, that would be helpful.
Okay.
I appreciate your enthusiasm. Don't really have that. I feel guilty already.
It does really get kind of an interesting thought process when you start deciding, you can get villain, but what stamps the supervillain? Because is it because they dress up? Is it because of the power? Because you think like someone like Kick-Ass, the moment he got out of costume, he thought, well, I'm a superhero because I'm in a costume. So what makes a supervillain? Is it the costume? Is it the power? I think that's what's really kind of the interesting thing is deciding, obviously if you're doing something quote unquote bad, you can stamp someone a villain, but what crosses the line of becoming super, not just a villain, but super, is something that I've thought about a lot. That goes for the hero side too. I mean, the character that I have in my fiction podcast is someone who just is more like Batman, doesn't have superpowers, but has very specific reasons why she became a hero. But as said, even in the show, I don't consider myself super, because it goes back to the whole what makes super in the title.
But a lot of with being a villain, you also have to look at the perspective, because, for example, Loki is a villain traditionally, but he also can be looked at as a hero if you're looking at it from his perspective and his motivation. So there's not always a clear line on if someone is a hero or a villain. It depends on which aspect you're looking at.
Yeah, or somebody who's doing something like Thanos, maybe, for example, who's doing something that he thinks is not evil or bad, but is the right thing. But then you have people fighting him that think, killing a bunch of people is not a good thing. But you actually watch that film and you actually start to almost feel like he's got some reasoning to it, even though you don't want him to do it.
Are we breaking this down to an argument of there's a universal truth or might makes right?
Well, this is psychology, not philosophy.
Okay. Read hard evidence.
Yeah, you guys brought up real-world villains faster than we usually get to. I will point out, the more time we spend on the real ones, the darker the subject tends to get. Usually this panel tends to be a fun one, but the more we talk about the real ones, I'm about to do it. But some of the examples you were mentioning, it's like you were naming, you gave unique names. Zodiac Killer,
Right.
Jack the Ripper, so they have special names. You also mentioned someone from the audience threw out Hitler. And he didn't say which Hitler. He didn't say like Aaron Hitler, Roy Hitler. So we knew which Hitler you meant.
Yeah.
It's kind of an unusual name. Like the name Gacy is an unusual last name. I've met Gacy's, but not the one that you all knew I was talking about.
Yeah, and the pogo aspect too. Maybe it's an element of theatricality that makes the turn from being just a villain to a supervillain too. That if there is something that gives an aura of fiction, or I'm losing the word that I had in my head a second ago. Just something that gives like an aura that's just beyond like, I hunt people and stay out.
And then go home.
Maybe that's the thing that makes the difference. Like, why did Zodiac taunt the police? Why did Jack the Ripper taunt the police and correct them when someone else fake taunted the police in his place? Like, what was it about his ego that made it so necessary that he had to like become part of the game of taunting the cops.
So is ego part of what comes into when we talk about what's really a super? You could have a costume villain in a comic book who you might not think of as a supervillain the same way. Is ego part of what really defines who's a supervillain? It's like, why dress like, you know, a guy wearing question marks if there's not an ego involved? There was a particular story in which the Penguin made a comment. What's the point in committing the perfect crime if no one knows it was you who did it? So there's attention-seeking aspect to it. And the Green, I don't want to keep naming serial killers, but the Green River Killer, who people don't know things about him as an individual, because he was not that interesting a person himself. He was not seeking attention. He was named that because of the sheer scale of what he did. But he isn't the one we bring up when talking about these kind of characters, such as the Unabomber and others, because he's missing the theatricality, the name. It's not like people are admiring those folks. For our comic book supervillains, where we don't have the room go quite as still when we talk about them, what makes for a really great, interesting comic book supervillain? The ones who are the best known. Why? I'm not going to tell you which ones, because I'll just start naming Batman villains.
I think motivation comes down to it a lot. I mean, having the guy that's going to be evil or chaotic evil just for the sake of being evil or to go against the hero, to me, are not that interesting to people. Like, just saying no because I said yes does not make you a great villain. But, you know, a great Batman villain that I've always enjoyed is Joker. And a lot of people don't see a means to his madness, but there's really a very set means. I mean, I think Heath Ledger did a great job in that and showed up how he set up individual scenarios to really test people and test their morality, what they were going through. And even though he said there's no means to this, there's no way you can be that complex in how you set up a scenario without having a means to your madness.
Yeah, I think for me on a larger story scale, I mean, this might be oversimplifying it a little bit, but when I'm watching something or I'm immersed in something, I think a superhero is really effective if by halfway or three-fourths of the way, I want the hero to come in and kick their ass. You know, I want to be really cheering for the hero to defeat the villain. So that means the villain is obviously doing things that are making an impact story-wise. I was talking to someone after the panel earlier today about when I was a kid, going to see the the second Superman film, Christopher Reeve. And as a kid, how I was just getting so angry at General Zod creating all this chaos while Superman wasn't around, that when he showed up and got in front of that window and said, "General, would you like to step outside?" As a kid, I went, "Yes, go get him, go get him." And then the guy that was talking to me responded with that, said, "You know, I haven't felt that way in a long time when I've gone to the movie." So I think that's one of the things that I like about supervillains. If I really want them to go down by the end of the story, then they're obviously doing their job.
I believe 1981 was the year you were.
I was thinking 80 or 81, yeah.
For me, I was actually talking to my wife last night about this panel and trying to figure out who was my favorite supervillain. And I came back to Sinestro, of all people, because it is a fictional villain, but the element of fear is something you can also relate back to the real world. It's something we all have to deal with, so it's a relatable emotion. And to see how Jordan or someone in the Green Lantern Corps fighting fear, it's something we ourselves have to fight, and kind of makes us feel like we're heroes in our own right.
I think also the ones that really stand out have distinctive looks. You're not mistaking them for anybody else. Norman Osborn, even when he's not in the costume, you know him by that weird hair of his in the comic books.
Sorry, I love Norman Osborn. Love the character.
So, do any of them know? Do any of them think of themselves as evil?
The Joker does. He knows he's evil. He knows who he is.
That's what's fun about it for him.
Yeah.
But so I was thinking about this before too. Even if he knows he's evil, he still thinks he's right.
Right.
He still thinks that that's the right way to behave and everybody should be that way. So even though it's like, this is a bad thing to do, everybody should do bad things, it's still justified in his head. I'm sure there are some villains usually they're kind of like the end bosses of like big story arcs where it's like, no, I'm the devil. I was behind the whole thing, and I'm just another version of the devil. Like in DC's Underworld series from a while back, where their version of Satan came and gave everybody higher powers, and his motivation was, I'm evil, and I just want more evil things to happen. But he wasn't super interesting. He was just super powerful. And that's a mistake I think a lot of writers can make, is being like, well, if the villain's like God, then obviously he's effective. Not as a character. Not if he doesn't have a motivation, something we can grab hold of.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the reasons I love Sweeney Todd, who I perceive to be a villain in the story, is because of how interesting his movies are. I mean, he's clearly going for revenge, but he's going about it in a non-socially acceptable manner, and it makes him very intriguing. We see a lot of this sense with characters in literature. Of course, he has the wonderful hair that allows us all to know who he is. But I mean, we have Iago and the Wicked Witch of the West and all these other characters who I think very much embrace their evilness, and they still follow through with being who they are because they think it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, Iago 100% I think is maybe the best version of the I'm a villain and I don't care that I'm a villain. I think it's great. And I do the things I do just because I do them. It's really the closest analog is the Joker for Iago from Shakespeare, if anybody doesn't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You guys should read it, it's been around for a while. But yeah, Iago, man, it's really good. It's really good. And there's almost no better way to play him than like mustache twirly. I will take a fellow and turn him.
And maybe these two things kind of play together. We talk about ego with villains, but I think it comes more down to narcissism. Mm-hmm. That you have that evil character has to have that narcissism about themselves, so that even if they understand there's another point, they always place it a few notches down from their own perspective.
So what does the supervillain do in their casual moments? Do they have casual moments? Do they ever decide, I don't want to, wipe out a city today. I want to go watch a movie. Do they have time for this?
I guess something about the Joker watching Breaking Bad.
So there's a fairly obscure Ben Endlin comic. It's not going to sound obscure when I say it, but Mystery Men, right? The movie Mystery Men, which is amazing. He wrote a 4-issue comic that wasn't based around the series at all. They loosely based the movie around these sort of like low-level superheroes and supervillains. He did a 1-issue story that was just supervillains that had like blast powers and super strength or whatever, but it wasn't about them pulling heists. It was kind of about the things they did in between, which was like get drunk, trash hotel rooms, and then drive to the next town, and just rob everything because they just had no moral qualms about doing it. And I was like, well, that's probably pretty accurate. Like, if you're willing to like blow up a building to make Batman mad, then you're probably not going to be too upset about being like, oh, I'm not paying for this gum.
Yeah, I don't mean to talk over everybody with this, but I think that we've seen a lot of change in the way that we perceive villains, over the past 50 to 60 years. And for me, my genre is fantasy, so that's what I oftentimes think about things in terms of. But J.R.R. Tolkien's time, everything was very black and white in the way that he wrote Lord of the Rings. You had your evil, you had your good. And fantasy has evolved in time where it's moved to more of the Game of Thrones mentality, where there's multiple shades of gray, and your characters have both good and negative traits that they are bound by. I mean, I know we see this, of course, in the Game of Thrones television show with Jaime Lannister, and how he has both this good and dark side that kind of fight back and forth against each other. But Deborah Wolf writes a book, I mentioned this yesterday in a podcast, called The Fantasy Fiction Formula. And it says that when you make villains, you should make sure they have 5 negative traits and 2 positive traits. And I imagine during a villain's off time, he's probably focusing on some of those positive traits that he's working with. It's just whenever you see him, those 5 other traits overwhelm him to the point that that's really what the public sees.
Yeah, like Lex Luthor making boats in a bottle or something.
Yeah.
Some of the discussion most recently about supervillains has had to do with 2 particular Marvel villains lately. Thanos, who you already brought up, and Eric Killmonger.
Yeah.
Who, even though online it was listed as Kill Longer for the panel, I'm sure he does, but
Take your time.
what is it about those 2 in particular that's really grabbing people's attention right now?
think some of it was already addressed as far as Thanos goes, is that he doesn't perceive himself as a villain. He thinks he's the only one that can make the decision that's going to save the universe. And everyone trying to stop him is the villain. And I think if some of his motivation, once you watch the movie all the way through, you start to actually sympathize with him in a lot of cases. And don't agree with him, but at least see, okay, he doesn't think he's evil.
Yeah, and that makes it kind of a challenge, but also kind of a fun element too. I mean, sometimes the reasoning behind what they're doing, I guess it comes down to, up to that point, what have they done in their plans? I mean, have they killed a bunch of people? Have they done a bunch of things yet? Or have they spent a lot of time showing you why they are taking the approach they're taking? Because there are, I think sometimes, depending on how far they get down that road, even as an audience member, I might be thinking, well, maybe there's something the hero could do, or maybe there's something that can turn him around. You know, because you do feel like there's some legitimacy to maybe what they're trying to do, not so much Thanos, but maybe Killmonger, or maybe even Bushmaster in the last Luke Cage. It's almost like a Darth Vader thing. You know, he's evil and he's ruling the universe and he's doing all these bad things, but you spend most of it with Luke going, you know, but there's good in him. You can turn around and show that he can, you know, be good even though he's doing evil things right now. So that does make it kind of fun, where it's just not as clear as day that one versus the other, and that's clear where you're pulling from.
Yeah, popular discussion over Killmonger has to do with the areas where you look at it, it's like, he's right. And at the end of the movie, Black Panther and others seem to show they've actually picked up, for what they've gone through, they picked up some of those lessons.
Yeah.
But he's also the guy who destroys the heart-shaped herb. He does seem to be clearly far more motivated by his own anger at the world than concern for the future, concern for his own people. He's got thoughts about them, but empathy is a different issue. When we look at the things of what we consider to be the worst people in the world, we look at sadism and ego and Machiavellianism, manipulativeness, and this thing called psychopathy. Anybody here know what psychopathy is? That's up here.
It's a cool word.
All right, there you go.
Isn't that the expression of the psychopathic behavior of a person, or just their mental illness? I could be wrong.
It's in psychosis.
Psychopathy, as classically defined, it has to do with the lack of empathy for other people, the lack of the emotional aspects of a conscience. So they can know right and wrong, they don't care. They don't feel about those the same way the rest of us do. You have certain issues you don't care about, but that doesn't mean you never care or you never have empathy for other individuals. You can have a high-functioning psychopath. You have somebody who's like, yeah, they don't care how you feel, but there are places in the world where that's useful. There's certain occupations that have a higher rate of psychopaths. They've channeled it in a useful direction. Or it's rangers in the army, their snipers seem to have a higher rate of psychopaths among them.
Isn't there a term, pro-social psychopath?
Or pro-social psychopath or high-functioning psychopath.
Right.
That's where it's not interfering in life in the same way. There are things that are missing out. There are qualities that are missing from people.
Sure.
But they're not necessarily motivated. They're not necessarily motivated to actively do harm. You have a psychopath who is not sadistic, who's not actively taking delight in hurting others. Another occupation that has a high rate of psychopaths, master chefs. They really don't care what your review is or what your food allergy is. This is what they're fixing. Ministers have a higher rate of psychopaths measured among them. I'm just saying it right. I'm not saying at most, or this is more than average. So there are occupations where they wind up. That's not always a good thing, but there are areas in which it's like, okay, good. We don't need you to sit down crying. We need you to go deal with this. So there are high-functioning psychopaths. There's something called the James Bond personality. For the high-functioning psychopath, who is egotistical and manipulative, but has found a way to channel all of that into something socially useful. Perhaps out of loyalty to something particular, in this case it's this country, rather than feelings to particular individuals. And I mean, all of those are the qualities we call the dark triad, not the McDonald's triad, that's something else. The dark triad, that Machiavellianism, the manipulative, the narcissism, and psychopathy, that combination is a pretty bad combination. If you have a manipulative, egotistical psychopath in your life, generally you just kind of wanted to not be around them because they're a big old pain. Oh, to put it nicely, because we do have mixed audience. The researchers originally identified that dark triad and realized something was missing. There was sadism, that taking active delight in cruelty. Is Thanos sadistic? Is he taking delight in his cruelty? Or ever?
He seems more apathetic.
Yeah.
Outside of Gamora. He seems more apathetic about the cruelty that he does.
He seems to see it as something that has to be done.
Does Killmonger take delight in the cruelty? Does he enjoy? You don't tend to rack up that many marks for killing that many people if you're not enjoying something about it and wanting to tell everybody.
There's got to be something rewarding.
There has to be something else that's rewarding about it. You know, a character like the Joker, it's easy to see where there's a sadistic quality. These ones where we're looking at the ones where we're not as sure about, when people are wearing Magneto's right shirts. Is Magneto taking delight in hurting people? It expresses anger, but that's not his motivation.
And it always depends on which version of the character we're looking at too, because you know the earliest version of the character was like, "Wow, X-Men," and so we're all the villains.
You can probably find that in the actual dialogue in those comics.
I'm fairly sure the justification for the behavior wasn't important until like the 70s in a lot of comics. But I'll assume we're going to be talking about the more recent stuff involving comics and movies. Because if we just focus on the stuff from like the 40s, 50s, and 60s from comic books, it's just going to be like, why did they do what they did? Because Batman needed a villain that month.
Why did Dillinger rob banks? Because that's where the money was.
Yeah.
You know, why did villains do things back then? Because villains.
Yeah.
So that, this is what I was saying earlier. I think that the level of how we see villains has evolved, or at least changed from how we see villains with motivations. They're not just bad to be bad.
Yeah, I remember Roger Ebert used to rail on movies where he felt that, you know, there was a hero and villain element, but the villain's here to destroy the world. Why? We don't know. We never find out. They're just there to do that. Yeah.
Who's, out of you, do you have, if you don't have a specific, that's your favorite supervillain, a favorite supervillain, and why? All right, they're stalling. I'm going to throw out the Joker so none of them can use it. Why? Because Batman.
I can go.
Let me think about this first.
I got one. So, because I mentioned it before, the modern Norman Osborn, to me, is like one of my favorite villains of all time. The way they brought him back, if anybody reads comics, was very dumb and very poorly handled. But once he was back, and he was trying really hard to not be the Green Goblin, and the stuff that they did with him in Thunderbolts and during Dark Reign, where he's trying so hard to not be Green Goblin, is amazing. And then when he does become Green Goblin, it's terrifying. They fell backwards, Marvel, into creating a supervillain that was both Lex Luthor and the Joker at the same time. And I think it's brilliant. He's a great villain because you don't know which one you're getting. At any moment, he could go from being Lex Luthor to being the Joker. Imagine Batman dealing with that, or Superman dealing with that. It's amazing.
Kind of already talked about it earlier. Favorite Sinestro, but aside from that, Loki, especially the way that he's portrayed in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because I don't even see him as a villain. He destroyed New York and that was bad. But other than that, they destroyed the city. But other than that, a lot of what he did was what he felt was right, and I think I've actually sympathized with him more than any other villain. He feels like he was cheated out of his birthright. When Thor was cast out, he should have been king. He finds out he was adopted. Odin lied to him. His father didn't want him. And so he's just trying to get what he feels like is his rightful place. And at the end of the day, he does kind of save Asgard.
The hunter, all right.
No, I mean, I don't really have, I hate to cheap out on it, but I mean,
And who's a really interesting one?
well, I already mentioned.
One you have not mentioned.
Okay, well then let's go to him.
I actually look at people I want to pull right out of history, which I don't know if I would count Supervillian, but Ursula Bathory was a really popular one that I always enjoyed. I mean, I would like to sit down at a table and eat a meal with her just to find out what was going on in that time.
Really? You sure what that meal would consist
I
of?
want it to be a long table, I want my own, like, connoisseur coming to bring food, but.
Look up Elizabeth Bathory vampire stories, okay?
Yeah, but yeah, she essentially was known for bathing in the blood of female virgins and killing them and torturing them and all types of things. And I mean, she had her own political strife that was going on during that time in Romania and Hungary and people coming after her for her wealth and those types of things. But I think that she was a very fascinating person in history.
All right. I really liked Hela in the Thor film a lot. And truth be told, I wasn't immersed in comics growing up, so that was really kind of one of my first exposures to her. And I thought, I mean, we were talking about costume and everything. I mean, she stole every scene she was in. Of course, part of that's Kate. But I mean, really, I just thought being that powerful of a villain, being able to take on Thor first and foremost is pretty big. But I just loved her cockiness and her power and the costume and just how she was ready to rule.
Okay, audience members, questions, comments, insults. I'm going by hand. And between questions, don't leave your hands up waiting for the next one, because then you're blocking somebody's view, okay?
Yeah, I was wondering what your guys' thoughts were on kind of the, how supervillains often can be just completely revered. It's more of a question of, social psychology or individual psychology, but thinking specifically about Darth Vader. He strikes me as a quintessentially evil figure throughout 2 3/4 of the movie. And I just always have wondered where that comes from in society, why you think he is such a idolized figure.
He has a really weird sense of humor. That design, a different design, we would not have become fascinated with Darth in that first one. Why was anybody interested in Boba Fett? The design got people curious. So the design is part of what starts with our interest in Darth Vader. And you get the sense that this guy is doing these things. He's a scary guy. Although I always point out that after his son blows up a Death Star, he stops killing rebels. He only kills Imperials after that. And this is a lonely man. He'd followed the Emperor. He's obviously disillusioned with that, but he doesn't see anything better later on. And so he has this odd kind of loneliness, and we get that. And we get feeling isolated. You can be one of those popular people of all, and you still have times when you feel disconnected from others. So we get a lot of those kind of things. And some of that loneliness was conveyed with Vader in those movies in odd little ways. And he has a cool sounding name, Darth Vader.
Voice helps.
So,
Oh, yeah, you gotta have voice. Imagine Jerry Lewis. And then we don't want to hear him again. Yes.
So what do you think makes the best motivations for a villain?
Well, that's some of that. Well, best in what way? Best and most interesting, or best for story?
Best in either most interesting or most realistic.
Okay, interesting or realistic? Okay, those are different things.
For me, it's got to be seated pretty deep within them. I mean, a lot of people who we consider to be supervillains are going to have some sort of psychopathology that's going to start at a pretty young age. I mean, the new research that I know, that maybe you know something different, but last I looked, was that we've seen that most people actually develop their personality by the time they're about 6 years old, and it has to do with the parent-child relationship. So it starts very young, being ingrained into the child's brain and how that comes together. And so what's going on with supervillain needs to be something that's threaded and seated very deep, and it evolves over time, so much to the point that it's second nature to them. You can't have somebody that has something that just radically happens to them and then they blow up and make that their mantra.
So one bad day won't do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it needs to be something that's ongoing. Yeah.
That is actually something that drives me crazy in the stories. They love to have it where somebody who's actually a decent person, one bad thing happens, and then they're mass murderers. They're serial killers. That does not happen in the real world.
I mean, it kind of goes back to when we were talking earlier about, it's just not good enough anymore to necessarily be doing bad things because you're the villain. I think about what Robert McKee says frequently when he talks about writing story and characters, when he says write the truth. At the end of the day, I just need to believe in their reasoning for doing it. And like you're saying, that one thing is probably not gonna, make
That's
me
why
believe the
I
rest
don't
of
care
the
for
way.
Two-Face. I mean, Two-Face to me is not a supervillain. He
Yeah.
had one thing and he just completely flipped on a switch. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
You say Two-Face?
Yeah.
Well, it depends on which thing.
version?
Versions they have.
You mean not the Tommy Lee Jones version?
But yeah, there's the thing with Harvey is that he may have become a supervillain called Harvey Dent at a certain point. The Two-Face thing is just what flipped the switch at that moment. But the idea that he could have always be, in the movie, he was playing the hero, but he knew he might become a villain someday. The thing happened that made that happen for him in the film. I really love Two-Face. Sorry, it's one of my favorites.
And one of
We'll
the-
take this outside hour.
One of the things in that movie that are in Erasmus that most clearly touches on how there'd been something there already is a reference earlier. He already had the nickname Two-Face. They don't really show us why, but he already had that nickname. Batman the Animated Series, they take a dissociative thing with it, but still, they lay down that there was already this stuff in him, and then the circumstance brought it out. Okay, see various hands. Oop, this one went first this time.
I guess it's more of a comment, I don't know. But we were talking about motivations for these supervillains. I'm a special education teacher, so all I'm thinking about over here is like, man, somebody really needs to do a functional behavior assessment on these guys and like figure out what their, the function of their behavior is.
Or for next year, there may be a book coming out, The Joker Psychology, Evil Clowns and the Women Who Love Them, but if we're doing that, I can't tell you that yet. Right there.
Hi, so y'all have kind of talked about it, but over the last 60 years or so, we've seen this cultural shift from this place where villains are basically just these cartoonish characters of evil that don't really have any motivations, to something where we won't really accept a villain that doesn't have kind of redeeming qualities. In your mind, who are the main either villains or storylines that either marked or caused that cultural shift in big moments?
Okay, by cultural shift, you talk, at what level? You talk about within comics, within movies, within popular interests?
Just from the shift from where we don't care about what is causing them to be evil to now where we so firmly need that component of their personality. Who were the big villains in history that kind of caused that shift in our minds?
I don't know.
You've made the question even broader than it was in the application.
I don't know what came first, the chicken or the egg, but I mean, in terms
The
of
egg,
in terms of-
reptiles were around laying eggs before they were chickens.
Did the anti-hero come before the villain? Because the anti-hero, I think, is where we really started balancing out these redeeming qualities that are in people. I think of Rorschach and characters like that, where they're evil, but they're doing evil for good. I mean, Sweeney Todd kind of falls in that as well. Which one is first? Did the anti-hero come and we found redeeming qualities, and we went back and found redeeming qualities for villains? I don't know the answer.
I'm going to go in a different direction. Media's cyclical, right? The way stories are told is cyclical. And new media might change how heroes and villains are portrayed. I think it's a mistake. So I know saying in the past 100 years is short-sighted, but I would say it is. We've had complicated villains and simple villains all throughout history, from the first stories until now. Now, if you want to get specific as to when comic books shifted, it's the 70s. It's when Denny O'Neil took Batman and said the guy before Denny O'Neil, regardless, said we're going to stop making goofy Batman stories, we're going to make them serious again. We're going to have Green Lantern and Green Arrow talk about social issues instead of just fight people in space or hit people with punching, boxing above arrows. That's when the time happened, and that's also when films started to get more complicated. When you started having the early stuff, the independent cinema in the United States with things like Taxi Driver, Mean Streets, that were influenced by filmmakers from the 50s and 60s in Europe and Japan, making more complicated films. So the reason your question was tough is because you're trying to find a moment that doesn't really exist.
You can.
My question was about earlier when you guys were talking about Thanos and how he was apathetic towards it. He didn't really have any bad intentions. He just wanted to make the universe to where people weren't struggling. My question was, if that was the case, why wouldn't he just double the resources of the universe instead of just killing half the universe? He had to have some sort of, he was a fighter, so he thought the best way was to get rid of the people instead of improving the circumstances.
It's a very legitimate question. Okay, that's our 5-minute warning, by the way. 5 minutes. Stop!
Time to go.
Yes, also, and the filmmakers have said, even though it didn't look like in the movie, they said that he also killed half the plants. So there goes a whole lot of those resources he's talking about.
Right?
Yes, like there's like, why didn't you make that choice instead of a different way? And that does go back to some of the choices and intent. You look at the real world, anybody who's killed massive numbers of people, say 6 million of one ethnic group and 5 million of another at a particular point in history, no matter what their intent was, we call it evil. What they want to put about Thanos' logic, this idea, a lot of people think, oh, this makes sense. If you reduce the number of people, okay, the world's population right now, do you know, guess what year it was half of what it is right now? 1973. So on average, you all got it right. 1973, the world's population is half of what it is now. That's nothing on the cosmic scale. On the cosmic scale, Thanos accomplished nothing.
Right.
Which one reason I went into that is because last time we did this panel, instead of, I letting me jump on that, one of the panelists went to an audience member that I didn't want to call on yet, and I didn't get to say it last time. And I said, any other thoughts?
I don't know. It's just, to me, you could sometimes with character motivations not making sense. It's just bad writing.
But we understand Thanos' thought. People intuitively get that one.
Then it has to be something in the fact that he has a lack of imagination, or because he's an alien, he doesn't see that as a possibility. You know, if he's supposed to be an analog for a human with human thoughts, then how can he not come to a different conclusion? It drives. I try not to think about this stuff too much because I really like it. I really do, and I don't want to sit there and be like, oh, well, I hate this movie now because I think too much. So I tend to just go.
Well, that's just it. That's what I was going to ask. I mean, is that excusable? Because I think you could do that with so many elements of superhero movies. I mean, we've on podcasts we've talked about, when a report will come out from a physicist who's talking about the physics of this, and it's like Sheldon talking about Superman saving Lois Lane, and really what should have happened when she hit his arms is she was split into 3 pieces. So I mean, at that point, I'm wondering if it's ever excusable to go, well, he did this instead of that because in the superhero realm, it made for a better story, I guess.
There's just agreed with you for no reason. I don't know why. She just said that's what I figured.
She and I go way
Right. We got about 2 minutes left. Marvin, you had something earlier.
What would you think about villains that are usually the main characters? There's this one show called Villainous, which is it's a Spanish kind of show, Cartoon Network, where it's basically the main characters are the actual villains, not heroes, and rarely superheroes. So what do you think of a villain that is supposedly the main character?
Well, I think for me it depends on the story. And I know you write lots of villains.
Yeah.
I think we could get tired of those stories. I'm always seeing it from the villain side, but there could be some interesting. Why don't we see more stories from the villain's point of view? So, panelists, what do you think of stories with the villains as the protagonist, the main character?
I think you said, like you said, it depends on the villain. If you can get a compelling story, you have to have a villain that's a 3-dimensional character to begin with. And but there have been some, like Harley Quinn's had her own title, a Loki. So we have seen that, and when it's a compelling character like that, I think it works really well.
Are they going to do a movie?
Dr. Horrible.
Yeah, they're going to do Gotham City Sirens.
Dr. Horrible.
They go back and forth on that.
Oh, okay. Well, they might.
Here's what I would say about villains as protagonists in stories. What ends up happening a lot, and I think it's necessary, is we watch superheroes. They are reactive to what's happening to them. when we see only a proactive story where someone is doing things and then succeeding and walking away, I don't know how compelling that is. They need things to get in their way so that they become reactive. So in that way, they end up becoming, we tell simpler stories, like Suicide Squad, the comic book. You know, that was, let's take these villains and then have them do hero stuff. Except maybe they, you know, kill some people along the way. Just make them reactive. I don't know if you could tell a long-term story where it's just, I do this, 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 and I succeeded at everything, and then the world's mine. That's not a great story. It's still got to have, like, things getting in the way. You could look at Die Hard, the movie Die Hard, as being a story of villains who then have to react to a hero showing up and getting in their way, except we spend all our time with John McClane and not with the bad guys. But that would be a good movie. I want that movie.
That's essentially what it is. You're just reversing the tables. I mean, you're looking through the eyes of your villain and watching them go through a process. And the thing that I talked about earlier, like the difference between heroes and villains, is that heroes have qualities that they want to change, and through the course of the story, oftentimes you see that they are able to make those changes. Or with a villain, through the course of the story, they may confront different scenarios where the hero would change and flip at that moment, but the villain doesn't. They just keep pushing through. I'm thinking of that movie that actually happened with Denzel Washington, which is not a superhero movie, where he flies the plane and he's an alcoholic. And spoiler alert, he's still an alcoholic at the end of the movie. But that is like the story of a villain. It's where you're continuously backed into a wall and you don't change. You just keep going through in the way that you want to be able to do that psychosis that's affecting you, where you can't overcome it. And it comes to that point being like, this is just who I am. This is who I'm going to be. And there are things that come in your way that try to stop you, that you have to hurl over or try to get around. And I think that's the fun of it. But there's also a great study. I think it's fun to write from a villain's perspective, and why somebody asked, well, why do people like Darth Vader? There's this great study that came out by Psychology Today.
We are a minute over.
I'll go fast. It's essentially talking about how we all have these evil thoughts that pop through our heads throughout the day. And the people that are moral don't act upon them. But all of us kind of have these different fantasies, where we're smacking the person upside back the head, or,
Yes.
crashing a car off the road, or doing all these wild things that we don't do. But it's kind of fun to live vicariously through other people's experiences in literature, movies, or comic books, and see that happening, because then we don't have to do it ourselves.
Makes me think of Falling Down with
Romanticism.
That's a one moment.
Yeah.
So we are out of time. We are past out of time. So where can anybody find you here at the convention or online? I think my table is 834. They moved me to a better spot and didn't put the number there. And I'm at Superherologist on Twitter.
Barrett Tribe at the DOT Tribe, or at the Dark Knight Reads. Just check out my podcast, Dark Knight Reads, on Stitcher or iPod or whatever.
YouTube.com/JOFTV or on Twitter, official JOF.
I'm at Mr. Scott Murray on Twitter. The Crimson Files is thecrimsonfiles.com. Geek Supreme is geeksupreme.com. And Comic Book News is comicbooknews.com. And they're on iTunes, not a place you get podcasts.
And you guys can find me down at table 1048. I'm selling fantasy books with my wife, who is also a writer. You can also check out robertsonwrites.com. ROBERTSONWRITES. That's also my handle for Twitter, Instagram, Twitch, etc.
At 6 o'clock, I think is this room, although it might be roommate. Panel, So Bad They're Great. Movie, where we take a look at movies such The Room, Plan 9 from Outer Space, Troll 2, and other fantastic pieces of cinema, and why we love them so very much. Thank you.